I think it's important to understand the development of the IRA, the actions that they took, why they got to the places they got to, because it immediately reveals why the Irish have always historically been on the side of Palestinian emancipation. You very quickly understand why Irish people are considered based by leftists in general, and also why Irish people have historically been against colonial occupation, no matter where it is. Who cares about Trump? You tried to say the IRA isn't a terrorist organization. Bombing pubs in England is terrorism. No, I said that the designation for a terror organization is absolutely suitable for organizations that overwhelmingly target civilian populations. If you're talking about cops, that is not a part of the civilian population. Whether you agree to it or not doesn't matter. Cops in that regard, police in that regard, I'm not saying I agree with this, but police and military is enemy combatants. They're armed combatants, okay? Cops aren't military. I know cops aren't military, but cops still, in this regard, would be considered armed combatants. This is not even my designation, by the way. This is literally just like the official designation of terrorism. Ultimately, and I can't believe now we're going back to the IRA, the standard of violence is still designed by the colonial occupiers. And what the British forces did in Ireland was far more violent than the IRA's retaliation for what is seen, now at least, as a just cause. So I will not stand down from my defense. Okay? That's it. Resisting against colonial violence is always going to be a violent and sometimes ugly affair. Okay? The easiest way to ensure that ugliness and violence does not occur is by simply not occupying another country. It's that simple. And yet people never seem to understand this. British people don't seem to understand this because historically they were the occupiers, and American people certainly don't understand this because, again, same principle, historically occupiers. Everyone else around the world gets it. Everyone else, every other nation on this planet, for the most part, have a very different story, a story of overcoming great odds, a story of national liberators fighting long and hard against some semblance of colonial entity, some colonial occupation. Do you understand? With the exception of some nations that don't, nations that were historically dominant, okay? Even America has a version of this against the British Empire. So hilariously, at least I can point to the Revolutionary War for a second for Americans to kind of understand this dynamic. But that's it. You love watching terrorist freedom fighters on television and in movies, like real depictions, like Star Wars, directly created around promoting the Viet Cong. That was George Lucas's out and about intention at the time. Okay? The heroes in that story were the Viet Cong. At the time, America considered them to be terrorists. Same with Dune. Same with so many popular works. Okay? You love a good rebel story, but you hate it when you are the evil empire in the real world. That's it. Just curious in which authority this Asmongold guy talks about politics. You don't need authority to be able to talk about politics. And that's sometimes a good thing. And in other instances, it's a bad thing. But you don't need authority to talk about politics. And as a matter of fact, many people don't have it. That chatter is wrong about UK cops not being armed. They just ain't carrying guns 24/7 like US cops, but they regularly deploy armed cops in Northern Ireland and other places. Yeah, I know. Yeah. You know who else was a terrorist? John Brown. Okay? Straight up. John Brown was a terrorist. Yeah. He was fighting a just cause. He was fighting for a just cause, a moral one. Perhaps the most moral. The abolition of slavery. That's it. It's that simple. If you don't want violent retaliation, don't do chattel slavery. Anyway, speaking of people, Luigi Mangione has released his first statement to the public since his arrest. Luigi Mangione says, "I'm overwhelmed by and grateful for everyone who has written me to share their stories and express their support. Powerfully, this support has transcended political, racial, and even class divisions as mail has flooded MDC from across the country and around the globe. While it is impossible for me to reply to most letters, please know that I read everyone that I receive. Thank you again to everyone who took the time to write. I look forward to hearing more in the future."
Hi, everyone. It's Mike.
This channel has an amazing and really well-produced video on the Troubles and how the revolution remains. Ireland's unfinished revolution. Damn, the Horses channel is pretty good. They make bangers. I didn't know they did one on the Troubles.
The owner, operator, writer of the Horses creative project. Just want to do some table setting before this video. Spent the past 2 weeks making literally 20 different cuts of this video, and they were all blocked entirely from being viewed on YouTube. This is because the BBC owns the rights to most of the videos of the Irish Republican Army. The BBC vehemently does not want me to use that footage. The result is this version of my video, which is occasionally punctuated by these messages. If you want an uncensored director's cut, you can find that on the Horses Patreon. Which brings me to my next point. Moving forward, all Horses videos will be posted early, uncensored, and ad-free on Patreon before being put on YouTube. Patrons also get exclusive videos and a 20% off discount code for the Horses store. If you want to support my work, Patreon is a great way to do just that. Check it out at patreon.com/horsespt. Thank you. I hope you enjoy this video. When you think of the IRA, you likely imagine a wave of violence in 20th century Ireland. This is accurate in a sense, but it is a tiny, tiny snapshot of a much larger story. It is a story that spans 300 years. Even the popular term IRA is ambiguous to the point of near meaninglessness. There have been many, many different IRAs throughout this centuries-long conflict. Complex, polarizing, and intensely brutal, this is a story that will provoke very strong opinions. I think strong opinions are fine, but they should be informed. So, without further ado, this is the story of the Irish Republican Army. In the early 17th century, the British colonized a region in the northern part of Ireland called Ulster. Catholic Irish tenants and landlords were dispossessed of their lands. These properties were handed over to colonizing Protestants under the direction of King James I. And so began the harsh division of Protestants and Catholics in Ireland. This fighting went on for almost 2 centuries. It was bloody and brutal. As things continued, the English emerged quite victorious in their oppression and exploitation of the Irish people. But then, in 1791, a man named Wolfe Tone arrived to the picture. Tone, along with a group of fellow Irishmen, believed that the country should put aside its religious differences and unite against its common enemy, the invading British forces. Tone published a pamphlet advocating for this idea, titled An Argument on Behalf of the Catholics in Ireland. This pamphlet was enormously successful, and after its circulation, societies of United Irishmen began to appear in Ireland's largest cities. These societies sought a complete reform of the legislature, wanting instead a new system of governance based on political and religious liberty. Within Tone's efforts, we have perhaps the genesis of the first IRA. In 1795, he and some of his fellow United Irishmen proudly declared that they would never stop until they had driven the English from Ireland, until Ireland was a free country. In 1798, Tone led a revolt against the English establishment, which ended in defeat and his own death. His revolt had failed, and with it, England sought to stamp out the Irish independence movement with finality. They did this with the Act of Union in 1800, which destroyed the Irish Parliament entirely. Ireland could no longer legislate for itself in any way. Irish trade and industry were discriminated against and stifled in the interests of the British. Ireland was given no platform for self-advocacy. They had no voice in the new Parliament. Land was given to disinterested or entirely absent English landlords. The Catholic birth rate meant that Ireland's population was booming, but unmaintained land holdings, a lack of education, and ongoing sabotage of the Irish economy by the British meant that Ireland simply could not sustain its population. The now famous famine struck, killing 1 million Irish people. Another million emigrated, mainly to America. Indeed, this Irish-American presence would later prove invaluable to the yet established IRA. Aside from...
Yeah, if you want to know what real terror support looks like, there were literally American, Republican, right-wing, Irish politicians that were caught sending arms to the IRA. Okay? Just, yeah, I guess that was, maybe they misunderstood that that the IRA was also Republican, but a different kind. Yeah, it's like the good version of sending money to Israel. Exactly. It's like the reverse.
Disasters. The Act of Union created new social and political currents within Ireland. One of these was a desire to destroy the Act through the use of armed force. There also arose a desire to politically repeal the Act and establish instead home rule. the idea of a self-governing Ireland. In a sort of dramatic but perhaps predictable irony, England's Act of Union had begun to sow the seeds of dissent. In opposition to Wolfe Tone's legacy, there arose a group of Protestant ruling class elites named the Orange Order. These people were monstrous. The order started shootings, riots, and looting in the name of maintaining English rule. In times of peace, the Orange Order prevented Catholics.
Yep. IRA aid unit in the Bronx linked to flow of arms. Dublin. A major dispute over the scale of American fundraising for the Irish Republican Army has pitted officials in the United States, Britain, and Ireland against a Bronx-based relief organization for Roman Catholic women and children in Ulster. This video just moved past the famine without even addressing that it was a genocidal intentional starvation. Yeah, I think they definitely didn't go hard enough.
Catholics from owning homes.
They basically said that the British didn't care about the Irish, which is true, but...
Or renting apartments. They advocated for anti-Catholic discrimination when it came to employment. They circulated anti-Catholic propaganda. This was not entirely out of a specific hatred for the Catholics. Rather, the order wanted to keep Protestant and Catholic working classes divided violently so that they could never unite and overthrow the British government. Indeed, the order and its affiliates maneuvered politically to stamp out even the slightest whisper of home rule within Parliament. There is truly a saga of information and events we could discuss here, but still we have not even arrived at the formation of the Irish Republican Army, and that is the topic of this video. So we will accelerate our narrative, keeping in mind that despite the order's best efforts, a desire for home rule was rising. In the early 1900s, the Irish proposed a number of home rule parliamentary efforts. They were all rejected, but in these efforts, a political party known as Sinn Féin came into being. Sinn Féin sought independence for Ireland, but wished to accomplish it through political maneuvering alone. They brought to English Parliament a proposal which would make Ireland economically, politically, and culturally independent. Their proposal did not violate any part of English rule. It was peaceful, it was reasonable, and it was laid out in perfect diplomatic clarity. However, it was swiftly rejected. Unionists, those who sought to maintain English rule in Ireland, took note of this rising tide. In 1911, a Unionist leader in the Irish province of Ulster named Edward Carson made a contingency plan. This plan laid out a provisional government that would take power in Ulster should home rule ever be instituted. Nearly 250,000 Northern Unionists signed an agreement to resist home rule by any means necessary. These men titled themselves the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, and it was their sole aim to defeat home rule. In response, a group of nationalists, people who sought an independent Ireland, created Ógla na hÉireann, or the Irish Volunteer Force, as opposition to the Ulster Volunteer Force. The IVF would not engage immediately in armed combat against the UVF, but instead would remain on a sort of standby. Should the UVF ever act, the IVF would be there to defend Irish independence. But then World War I started, and in 1914, Parliament demanded that the nationalist IVF fight on England's side in the conflict. Many members obliged, but some 11,000 did not. They reasonably saw themselves as existing to defend and fight for Ireland, not England. It had become increasingly clear that Britain would ignore political maneuvering for home rule, but the new existence of the Unionist Ulster Volunteer Force now indicated that they were ready to defeat home rule with violence. On top,
England drew from many of its forces. Some of them learned a valuable lesson on the beaches of Gallipoli in World War I. A sad lesson, of course, that is still to this day talked about, which is weirdly enough not as negatively remembered as the British Empire forcing Anzac forces to go and die for no reason on the beaches of Gallipoli as they invaded a foreign empire at the time, or a foreign nation. And yet, you know, it should be the case. They should be very mad at the British for pushing them to do that. Gallipoli is a never again attitude from Australians who were forced by the British? Yes, but that's what I thought too. That's how it's taught in Turkey too. And that's the general attitude of a lot of the Australians and New Zealanders that come to Turkey to visit Gallipoli, who have like a relatively positive opinion of Turkish people, and also simultaneously think that it was like the fault of the British. But they also, from what I understand, it's broadly the opposite, where they think like, no, those were brave veteran heroes and we're not mad at the English, you know?
On top of this, the Crown now demanded that Irish nationalists fight for England. This was simply unthinkable. So, fed up with the continued failure of peaceful action, the nationalist IVF planned an armed uprising to occur on Easter Monday, 1916. On that day, an assembly of Irish nationalists moved into Dublin. They occupied the General Post Office and other important government buildings. These men demanded a free Ireland, proclaiming essentially...
You gotta explain to Americans what the you're talking about. During World War I, the British government forced the Anzac forces comprised of New Zealanders and Australians, to go and fight their battles, specifically in Gallipoli, Çanak, which is a part of Turkey. They stormed the beaches of Çanakkale, where the Ottoman forces, Turkish forces at the time, put up an incredibly strong defense and essentially murdered a shit ton. Well, not murdered, but like, you know, just ripped through it. It's like, it almost is like if D-Day was unsuccessful, except the Turks in this instance were not obviously Nazis or in the wrong. It was World War I. It was state against state violence. And the Turks were on the wrong side, let's say, the side that lost inevitably. A lesson that they luckily learned when they said they're not involving themselves in World War II. Turks in World War I were Nazis? Well, I guess that's true. Turks did do, at the time, the Armenian genocide. So there is that part of the equation. But in terms of like state versus state violence, it's not. World War I is a little bit different than World War II, I would say. Brave take? What do you mean? The way you say Armenia makes me cringe a little. Oh, wait, what? Why?
A secession from England. The IVF declared the Irish Republic as a sovereign independent state which would guarantee religious, civil, and equal rights to all of its citizens. Their statement also noted the invading English government had intentionally fostered a culture of religious differences in Ireland, but the Irish Republic would not support religious prosecution or sectarian conflict. They did not care if you were Protestant or Catholic. To the newly formed republic, you were just Irish. The IVF were over 1,000 strong, but England dispatched her own forces to crush the insurrection. One witness described the Easter Rising. The sound of artillery, of rifles, machine guns, grenades did not cease even for a moment. From my window I saw a red flare that crept to the sky and stole over it and remained there, glaring. The smoke reached from the ground to the clouds, and I could see great red sparks go soaring to enormous heights, while always in the calm air, hour after hour, there was the buzzing and rattling and thudding of guns. But for the guns, silence. Hundreds died at the Easter Rising. The British quite effectively squashed the rebellion. But the event changed Ireland forever. It is impossible to overstate the significance of the Easter Rising within Irish and IRA history. The Rising created a firm, indelible stamp of Irish republicanism. 7 men had signed the IVF Declaration of Independence. England executed them without mercy. In one instance, they strapped a disabled man, unable to stand, into a chair so that he could be shot in the head. Each day, the British carried out a couple of executions, and news traveled around the country. There had always been a widespread but tepid disdain for the British. The excitement of the Easter Rising had galvanized and even transmuted this sentiment into something profoundly more aggressive. Thousands of young men across the nation were suddenly awakened to the Irish Republican cause. The Rising and all the Irish infighting had been about Britain's occupation, but also about how to solve the issue. Some people believed in political action, while others wanted to be more forceful. The violence of the Easter Rising and resulting executions destroyed almost any interest in parliamentary political reform. The peaceful approach had been wholly ineffective and was now, in the wake of those events, inappropriate. After the rebellion, everyone seemed to agree. Aggressive, violent action was the only way forward. The Irish Revolution had begun. Membership in Irish Republican groups now meant extremely violent anti-British activity in preparation for an upcoming war. Nationalists tried to obtain arms by raiding civilians as well as English armories. There were violent confrontations between nationalists and British soldiers. In response, the Crown likewise raided homes and imprisoned Republicans at an unprecedented rate. This, of course, only served to militarize and galvanize the Republican movement. Indeed, prisons became something of a breeding ground for anti-British sentiment. The British government and its forces was being increasingly seen as hostile. Sinn Féin saw huge success in the 1918 UK general election and set up an alternative parliament of their own in Dublin called the Dáil. This parliament was led by military men and formerly imprisoned Republicans. With this, nationalists now had a legitimate political body of their own. This parliament was far from a functioning autonomous government, but it lended legitimacy to Irish republicanism across the country. Its forming was essentially a sort of propaganda. In the years that followed, the paramilitary wing of this parliament were known as volunteers. Violence continued to escalate, and the volunteers became a larger, more necessary part of the Republican movement. The volunteers colloquially earned a new name: the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. The war raged on in an endless cycle of newly heightened aggression and
I think it's important to understand the development of the IRA, the actions that they took, why they got to the places they got to, because it almost immediately reveals why the Irish has always historically been on the side of Palestinian emancipation. I don't know if this video will feature that at all, but you very quickly understand why Irish people are considered based or whatever the by leftists in general, and also why Irish people have historically been against colonial occupation, no matter where it is, and have been on the right side of history. The funniest part about it is that when I found out that the Sons of Ulster or whatever, like the British that maintained the occupation in Ireland, also are notoriously on the wrong side of history. Like they literally will have all. If you're in Ireland and you see all of the bad flags in a row, the Confederate flag, the Israeli flag, side by side with the British flag, just know that, you're in dangerous territory.
Retribution. The British could not overcome the widespread Republican support and would never grant Ireland independence anyways. Meanwhile, the Republicans were not remotely close to victory and would certainly run out of resources eventually. All signs were pointing towards a stalemate. Talks of a peace treaty began. Eventually, the groups produced the 1921 treaty. This partitioned Ireland into two distinct states, Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State.
Yeah, and the apartheid South African flag, they're just all historically on the wrong side of history. The Irish and the IRA historically on the right side of history. Those who opposed them historically on the wrong side of history.
Was made largely of Republican-led counties, but it had limited autonomy and it was to be included in the British Commonwealth. Furthermore, the Dáil would be destroyed and the country would be led.
And NA aren't? Do you think I would disagree with you in terms of North America, like the American government? No, I agree. We are the death dealers. We are often on the wrong side of history.
Led by a British governor.
With the very important and notable exception of World War II.
General. Altogether, the treaty was quite antithetical to the Republican cause.
Supporting IRA puts you on the right side of history. Lamau, that is one of the takes of all time. I am going to once again reiterate the position that I have maintained for a very long time. If you don't want any IRA activity, there is a very cool solution, okay? It's called Don't Occupy Ireland. That's what it's called. It's a very easy solution, okay? Oh, you don't like that the ANC is engaging in violent actions? Don't do an apartheid. Oh no, Hamas is a violent fundamentalist group. They're doing a lot of violence. It's like, don't do apartheid and genocide, because people will always, whatever you call them, people will always have the righteous moral goal of emancipation, no matter what. It is the most understandable human position. Okay? That's it. Yeah, he touched my boot while I was stepping on his throat. How violent. This is a shocking revelation for some who have almost always lived in the imperial core, but when you try to kill people, they don't like it. They resist it. They think, don't kill me. And at first they'll say, please don't kill me. And then inevitably, when they realize that you're going to keep killing them, they rise up in arms. They fight back. That's just how it is.
It provided neither a unified or liberated Ireland. Unsurprisingly, Republican opinion on the treaty was split. Some people saw it as a platform to move forward, while others deemed it a surrender. This division led to a brief civil war within the Free Irish State between anti-treaty and pro-treaty citizens. But backed largely by its resources, the pro-treaty side defeated the Republicans without too much of an issue. By 1924, the Civil War was over, and each of the new Irelands existed in a very tepid sort of peace. Here we will again accelerate our story to the next major world event, World War II. During the war, the IRA repeatedly declared their dedication to Irish independence. The treaty certainly had not left them satisfied. But with World War II, the IRA entered into a period that was basically marked by failure. The IRA engaged in brutal anti-British campaigns in both Northern and Southern Ireland, but they were largely ineffectual. They were haphazard, disorganized, and they created very little new momentum for republicanism within Ireland. The IRA also engaged with the British abroad during this time. In 1938, IRA leaders were dispatched to high-profile British areas, including Liverpool, Manchester, and London. They brought with them suitcases full of bomb-making supplies. The IRA began a bombing campaign in these major city centers. The campaign's intended targets were government property rather than human life. But still, one man died in a Manchester bombing, 5 were killed in an incident in Coventry, 55 others were injured during the campaign. 2 IRA members were hanged in connection with the campaign before it ended quite unceremoniously. It was another failure described by one IRA sympathizer as, quote, appallingly ill-conceived. World War II also saw the IRA enter its most troubling era, a sort of alliance with the Nazi Party in Germany. Irish Republicans had virtually nothing ideologically in common with the Nazis, but their practical interests did align. The Germans wanted to hurt the English, and so did the IRA. The IRA didn't really mince words either, saying in a 1940 statement, "Today England is locked in a life and death struggle with Germany and Italy. The lesson of history is plain. England's enemy is Ireland's ally." So to be clear, it was anti-Britishness that fueled the IRA's decision rather than any actual sympathy with Nazi Germany. However, as Richard English points out in his book Armed Struggle, the fact remains. The IRA opted for alliance rather than opposition to what was perhaps history's most horrifically evil regime. German agents traveled to Ireland to make contact with the IRA. The two groups made
That is the wrong side of history, to be fair.
plans for the IRA to assist Germany through espionage against the British. However, even these plans amounted to nothing at all and were characteristic of the IRA's continually failing efforts surrounding World War II. Really, the IRA left World War II with very little in terms of morale or momentum. Throughout the post-war period, the organization racked up casualties through poorly organized bombing.
By the way, there were plenty of other countries that did similar versions of this against the USSR at the time as well. It still doesn't make it appropriate or right. Yes, Finland.
Efforts while achieving almost nothing in terms of their Republican goals. But still, they were looking onwards towards their next major military operation. Being that Northern Ireland had remained under British rule, that area was the focus of the IRA's continued efforts. For years, they had been interested in a bombing campaign along the border between the two Irelands, and in 1956, they finally put this idea into action as Operation Harvest. The IRA would attack military installations, communications bases, and government property along the border with the goal of paralyzing Northern Ireland. 4 groups of IRA men were set up to attack northern border areas, while 20 organizers were dispatched to train more volunteers. In December of 1956, the IRA detonated a bomb in Derry, which destroyed the town's BBC transmitter. Immediately thereafter, the IRA raided a British Army barracks, though this was quite unsuccessful. In response to these incidents, Northern Ireland's Prime Minister introduced internment, the process of jailing Republicans without trial. Conditions in the jails likewise were troubling. According to one prisoner, IRA members were kept in solitary confinement for 15 hours through the week and 20 hours on Sundays. In response to internment, IRA attacks spread. In that same month, 4 bombs exploded outside of a police station. 2 weeks later, the IRA attacked another police station in the same county. The following year, bombs exploded at a police sergeant's house, severing both of his legs and eventually killing him. But still, the IRA's efforts were disorganized and ineffective. The result was bloodshed rather than political change. The violence did little to rally IRA sympathizers to the cause. Meanwhile, there just wasn't widespread support or sympathy for the IRA in Northern Ireland. In 1962, the IRA halted their border campaign, citing negative public sentiment in the North. Like most of their efforts surrounding World War II, this campaign had failed. Indeed, this failure all but ruined the IRA. They had, during the campaign, killed a number of their own soldiers. Public perception was dismal. At best, the IRA was now a tired, weak organization. At worst, it was just irrelevant. But soon, social change would come to Ireland, and the IRA would rise like never before. With the IRA in a woeful state, a change of leadership was in order. So a man named Cathal Golding was assigned as its new chief of staff. Golding was a near-iconic figure. He was attractive, charming, and eccentric. The radical ideas he held were packaged up in a rather enjoyable aesthetic experience. Golding brought with him a significant ideological shift. For one thing, while he did endorse violence when necessary, Golding did not see violence as the Route 1 path to achieving the IRA's goals. Rather, he wished to embark on a more political quest. Cahill was a pretty hardline Marxist. His understanding of the Irish Republican movement was class-based, saying, "The class that always plays the leading role in any national liberation struggle is the working class, the people of no property, the landless people, the industrial workers in the city, and the very small peasant farmer. These are the people who have traditionally supported the national liberation movements in Ireland all through the centuries. Rich people were never interested in national liberation. They are already liberated." These were not new ideas to the IRA, who had traditionally been vaguely socialist in nature. Cahill was continuously unapologetic about his leftist sensibilities as he pushed the organization further in this direction. We have been accused of
Beginning to feel like these guys are some real radical terrorists. I thought they were just like liberal, I'm pro-Democratic Party kind of guys. What's happening here? I don't really like what they're talking about. Okay, hold on now.
being to the left, but if that means seeking an end to partition, to the exploitation of our people, and placing them in the position of masters of their destiny rather than slaves of a capitalist economy, then we are to the left. Under his leadership, the IRA shifted its efforts from military training to political action. Golding's council altered Sinn Féin's constitution to include a socialist republic as the final goal of the IRA. Around this time, radical Republican groups began to appear across Ireland. These groups were activist organizations that engaged in debate, discussion, and public education. Called the Wolf Tone Societies, they built on past socialist sympathies within the IRA to move the organization forward into a new era. Cahill was influenced by and involved with the Wolf Tone Societies. He believed that the partitioning of Ireland was a result of artificial prejudice. The Protestant Anglican government encouraged division between Catholics and Protestants so that the country could not unite and overcome Britain. The route to change for Golding was then in civil rights, the uniting of working-class Protestants and Catholics. One IRA leader described this new strategy well when he asked, "How can unionism possibly survive when Protestant and Catholic are no longer at one another's throats, when discrimination has been dealt a body blow?" And so, in 1966, the Wolf Tone Societies and their IRA members began a civil rights campaign in Northern Ireland to end discrimination against Catholics. These societies believed they could unify the working classes of Protestants and Catholics. The campaign spread quickly, and there emerged a genuine civil rights movement, one far beyond anything the IRA was controlling or leading. Unfortunately, this movement did not cause unification, quite the opposite. Catholics had been experiencing discrimination for centuries, so the demand for equality mostly came as a demand for Protestants to change their ways rather than one of national unity or mutual action. Loyalists and Protestants saw the movement as a Catholic Republican one that was attacking their identity, so it only caused more division within Ireland. This all came to a tipping point on October 5th in Derry. Catholics marched demanding equal treatment in housing and employment. The British police force used water cannons and batons to violently put down the demonstration.
Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. JFK said that, by the way. Another Catholic man.
Violent attack against civil rights activists was seen not just around Ireland, but around the world. The images were striking. There were uniformed police officers violently brutalizing peaceful demonstrators to deny the most basic human rights. This day is typically considered the beginning of the Troubles. It would be false to say the IRA caused the Troubles, but certainly they fueled the civil rights movement, which spun out of control and did start the conflict. It was and is the most painful sort of irony. In their genuine, well-intentioned efforts to unify the country, the IRA had fractured it like never before. For months, there emerged a pattern of police on Catholic violence throughout major Irish cities. The police could no longer contain the chaos and requested British troops be deployed to Ireland. Indeed, they were. During a bloody month of August, the IRA clashed with British forces time and time again. Catholic families were forced from their homes by Protestants, with the police...
I only see police officers doing their jobs. What? I don't understand. I only see police officers just bravely doing their jobs against horrible odds here.
Conspicuously absent. In one incident, 4 Catholics, one of whom was a 9-year-old boy, were shot dead by British forces.
As an American, that's the job of the police, to be fair. That is what the police does.
Members bombed police stations and returned fire, but they were up against a force that was profoundly more capable than themselves. Because the IRA had largely shifted their focus to political action, they were unable to meet the royal forces with adequate opposition. So, Catholics came to some conclusions. The royal police and the loyalists were now violent aggressors. As such, the Catholics could only be defended through violent force. In times past, this had been the duty of the IRA, but the IRA was now largely a political organization incapable of providing sufficient protection. On August 24th, Irish Republicans held a secret meeting in Belfast. Angered by the IRA's movement towards nonviolent politics, these men sought a return to the traditional militaristic approach. The dissidents formed a new organization called the Provisional IRA. From here on out, the Provisional IRA would become the premier group of militant Republicans, far outshining the old IRA. The Provos were dedicated to a unified Irish Republic. In this effort, the first step was driving the British out of Ireland through the means of force. It has been alleged that the Provisional IRA were hooligans or thugs, young men with nothing better to do who sought glory instead of any political cause. This could not be further from the truth. The Provisional IRA's most founding members came from families with long-standing ties to the previous IRA. They were Catholic young men, typically from working-class backgrounds including builders, farmers, clerks, and industrial apprentices. Certainly these men were not prosperous titans, but they were not despondent. Most IRA members had solid, reliable jobs. They were productive members of society. Authorities have often attempted to paint the IRA as criminals, but records and independent studies indicate Provos had no particular inclination towards crime. Certainly many had been to jail, but there was no omnipresent lineage of career criminality. Instead, what they had in common was first-hand experience with either repression or outright violence committed by British loyalists. Indeed, IRA recruitment consistently rose with significant political events. The story of the Provisional IRA is not one of crime, but of political struggle. The IRA were not profiteers. The material rewards that membership produced, even to its highest-ranking officials, were meager at the very best. Accounts have shown that IRA members who attempted to enrich themselves from the conflict were exiled. Furthermore, the Provisional IRA famously did not do drugs, here referring to trafficking or distribution as a means of income. Lastly, there has been no evidence of widespread mental abnormality in the Provisional IRA. Despite regular attempts to paint members as crazed fanatics, this simply is not the case. In a formal study of political and non-political murderers within Northern Ireland, the conclusion was that political murderers, IRA members, were more psychologically stable than their counterparts. By all accounts, IRA members were remarkably normal. Certainly the Provisional IRA was not an organization of saints, but they were broadly regular people, not thugs, mafiosos, or glory hunters. It's important to recognize this reality so as not to erroneously diminish or assign their struggle with ulterior motives. The vast majority of the IRA were simply true believers motivated by a genuine political struggle. And so we get to the philosophy of the IRA. The reason for the old IRA's being was to ensure that nationalists in Ireland would never be left defenseless. The new Provisional IRA likewise saw themselves as defenders, entirely necessary due to the presence of an invading force. In this pursuit, they would use violence as required to protect the Catholic population. The Provos also had a spiritual power. There was a culture of hopelessness amongst Catholics at the time, and this new IRA now provided a prideful resistance. They represented a real opportunity for Catholics to defend themselves. Perhaps even more accurately, the Provos symbolized retaliation. They would hit anyone who hit them. That was a core tenet of Provisional IRA philosophy. This included the British Army, but also the Irish police or individual Protestants. The Provos, on paper, did not believe in sectarian conflict. They didn't care if you were Catholic or Protestant. But in practice, this conflict became a necessary duty. One IRA leader said in 1971, "We will attack Protestants only if they attacked Catholics, and we would do this simply because the Catholics would have no one else to defend them." Also core to the Provisional IRA was an idea of anti-imperialism. Britain had colonized Ireland and denied the country its most basic right to self-governance. This was foundationally, ethically wrong, and it was on this idea that the old IRA had been built. History had suggested that anti-colonialism was generally the correct viewpoint. The Provisional IRA saw themselves as inheriting that historical reality. The organization fundamentally rejected.
One of the most important aspects of terrorism that people have to contend with, that people have to understand, is that when I say the occupier sets the standard of violence, it's not just simply something that I'm mentioning here. terrorism is an act of desperation in most circumstances. Okay? I don't mean like the colonial enterprise that ISIS engages in, right? I mean terrorism like the ANC or the Algerian defense or the IRA in this circumstance. Like those acts of terrorism are done towards an infinitely more powerful enemy that is dominating every facet of your existence. It is only conducted once all of the other non-violent options are exhausted. People turn around and claim like, why didn't they peacefully protest or whatever? But the reality of the matter is that peaceful protest has effectively been neutered, rendered useless. Okay? Nobody wants to take up arms against others. I mean, it's uncomfortable, it's violent, it sucks. Your standard of living has to get to such a horrible position for you to basically engage in this kind of violence. Yes, the French resistance during World War II was terrorism. Exactly. Like, who the fuck wants to forfeit their life? Who wants to go out and not live comfortably? You know what I mean? Everyone wants to live comfortably. You only are pushed to that point.
Rejected conventional political maneuvering. Instead, they were a militant force. This had practical strategic implications. Through violence, the Provisional IRA would make it more costly for Britain to remain in Ireland than to let the country be free. This was basically the core around which their entire strategy existed. With that said, the Provos were not entirely apolitical. In 1971, the Provisional IRA released a plan for Ireland that demanded not only British withdrawal, but a fundamental restructuring of Ireland's political institutions. They also released proposals for a more immediate, actionable withdrawal of British troops based on a number of Provo stipulations. The Provisionals also committed themselves to an Irish socialist republic with democracy at its heart. They were broadly anti-capitalist, believing that capitalist economies created inequality. Although hard leftists, the Provos distanced themselves from communist organizations. They noted that the Soviet system had resulted in a denial of freedoms and basic human rights. The Provisionals were a largely Catholic organization, and so many of its members held quite conservative political beliefs. These were often at odds with the group's stated leftist sensibilities. The result was a sort of unhappy, inconvenient coexistence of these two ideologies, which occasionally reared its head. In one instance, a Catholic conservative IRA member refused to supply contraceptives to the organization despite the IRA's insistence that they could be used in bomb making. All of this existed within a tightly defined structure. The Provos were led by a 7-person Army Council, who were chosen by a 12-person Army Executive, who was in turn elected by a General Army Convention. There was also Sinn Féin, which now existed as the Provos' political counterpart. These two organizations were separate. The Provisional IRA was a military endeavor, where Sinn Féin was a political party, but membership between the two saw significant overlap. The Provisional IRA was far outgunned by the British, who were more capable in almost every technical capacity. So the Republicans engaged exclusively in urban guerrilla warfare. They famously brought the concept of the car bomb into the zeitgeist. IRA violence took many other forms too. These included assassinations, shooting sprees, kneecappings, sniper fire, riots, and ambushes. Of course, to do any of this, the organization needed resources, mainly weapons and financing. For both of these things, the IRA often looked abroad, to the USA. This turned out to be, perhaps unsurprisingly, a good decision. A man named George Harrison was born in Ireland in 1915. During his 20-odd years of living in Ireland, Harrison had indeed come to sympathize with the left-wing elements of the Republican movement, and that never quite slowed down. In 1938, he emigrated to America, where he held a passion for 3 things: socialism, Irish republicanism, and firearms. As a trade union activist, Harrison also had access to a network of international trading infrastructures. Harrison and a few of his comrades in America entered into a trade agreement with the IRA. They would purchase guns from one of their contacts and then ship the weapons to Ireland. Most notably, Harrison moved hundreds of light, powerful, and collapsible Armalite rifles into the hands of the IRA. These specific guns would later become a sort of icon of armed Irish republicanism.
Oh yeah.
After a couple years' work by Harrison and other gun smugglers, the IRA was remarkably well equipped. Harrison expressed only pride, later saying, "I sent thousands of guns to Ireland, and I'd do it again tomorrow. I'm only sorry I didn't send more." Along with guns, America provided the Provisional IRA with a great supply of money. A group called NORAID, the Irish Northern Aid Committee in New York, was established to raise funds for the Provos, and they did that quite effectively. The Irish American population was more than happy to chip in. Of course, financing also came from within Ireland. The Provisional IRA ran a number of legitimate businesses, including taxi services, brothels, pubs, and security firms. These were all strictly clandestine in nature, so today details are elusive. The Provos also had links to a number of less than savory income sources. Think bank robberies, hostage payments, heists, and extortion rackets. Again though, the IRA's accounting is not now, nor has it ever been, an open book. So all of this must be assigned to the world of rumor, theory, and speculation. Here I think the phrase show don't tell is coming to mind. So let's look at how the Provisional IRA put all of this theory into practice. In the summer of 1970, Protestant loyalists paraded through a Catholic area of Belfast. This was certainly meant as provocation, and it worked. A fight broke out, which resulted in the IRA fatally shooting 3 Protestants. News traveled to another area in Belfast called Short Strand. There, Catholics lived in a ghetto, dangerously close to Protestants. Anticipating trouble, the IRA took up arms in preparation for a possible Protestant attack in Short Strand. Sure enough, Protestants threw bombs at a Catholic church. IRA soldiers defended the church in a 5-hour gunfight. Although they took casualties, the IRA successfully fought off the Protestant attackers. This success showed the capability and power of this new Provisional IRA. It was a vindication of the schism and would go down in IRA history as an iconic event. These killings resulted in the Falls Curfew, during which British troops raided the homes of Republicans in search of weaponry. They were successful insofar as they found quite a few weapons, but they also heightened and cemented Provo support throughout Belfast. The curfew caused a massive swell in IRA recruitment, and so the Provos were ready for their first full-scale offensive. To kick things off, the IRA shot and killed 2 British soldiers in Belfast. The British Army soon returned fire, and the IRA did the same. The British increased their presence in Republican areas where they harassed and intimidated Catholics. And so once again, loyalist attempts to tamp down republicanism did just the opposite. The Provisional IRA began one of their first bombing campaigns in a drastic escalation of violence. The British Army's next move was yet another blunder. Under the name Operation Demetrius, loyalists arrested and imprisoned 342 Catholics, all without trial. But as it turned out, the British had received wildly inaccurate intelligence reports. Of these 342 prisoners, under 100 were at all affiliated with Republican efforts. Still, over 200 of the arrested men were kept in jails around Belfast. Internment without trial went on, and internees were horrifically abused in jails. They were denied sleep, starved.
Does that remind you of anything? Like in modern society?
Dehydrated and tortured. This whole issue was well publicized in Catholic circles, and once again the British had strengthened resistance to their own presence. With belief and enlistment soaring, the Provisional IRA were now in a full-scale war against the British-commanded Irish Army. In 1971, the Army killed 9 IRA members and 33 civilians. The IRA, meanwhile, killed 56 members of the opposition. The chaos was indeed what the Provos wanted. Remember, it was their aim to create an Ireland that was unsustainable for British rule. In 1972, the IRA was feeling immensely confident. They even proclaimed that England was on her knees and that victory would come soon. Of course, this did not happen. Quite the opposite. One of the Trouble's deadliest days was just ahead. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association organized a march against internment in Derry. Parades, processions, and marches had been banned for some time, but the association defiantly went on. Northern police set up barricades so that marchers could not go into the city center. Soldiers from the notoriously brutal Parachute Regiment attended, armed and quite ready for conflict. Derry was a hotbed for fighting, which had recently resulted in the death of several British soldiers. But even within the British Army itself, the Parachute Regiment was considered thuggish and reckless. They were basically attack dogs. Their presence at the march was controversial, with some army leaders confused why such an aggressive unit had been deployed. Marchers bypassed the barricades and proceeded to throw stones at the British soldiers. In response, the Parachute Regiment used water cannons and tear gas in an attempt to contain the crowd. A riot broke out, and the parachutes unloaded their rifles into the crowd. Some protesters were shot while fleeing, others while helping the injured. The parachutes killed 14 people that day, all unarmed civilians. The day would go down in history as Bloody Sunday. It was a defining day in the Troubles. This was a watershed moment for the Provisional IRA and for Republican efforts at large. The city reeled with anger. Bloody Sunday also attracted international attention. The IRA received global support for its militant republicanism, and internally, the organization abandoned entirely the idea of peaceful change. That summer, the IRA's violence reached its ascendancy. Car bombs were rampant around Belfast and Derry. Hundreds died throughout the country. The IRA likewise planted car bombs throughout London, ultimately killing one person and injuring 243 others. Even jails were chaotic. In 1973, leading provosts escaped from a Dublin prison via helicopter. The fighting roared on throughout the decade. In May of 1974, loyalists, allegedly assisted by British police, detonated bombs throughout Dublin. The British Army fatally shot a mentally disabled Catholic man for seemingly no reason. The IRA detonated 2 bombs without warning in crowded English pubs. Not long after, they repeated the attack in Birmingham, blowing up 2 more pubs within moments of each other. Upon arriving to the scene, an ambulance worker later remarked that it was, quote, like a slaughterhouse. The years that followed saw massacre after massacre, retaliation after retaliation. Although optimistic, the IRA came to a stark realization. In the late 1970s, the IRA explicitly set out for a so-called long war. Their fight would not be over in weeks or months.
I think, considering that all of this happened and not that long ago, and then you look back, or you look at the situation now between England and Ireland, you understand why I say that a peaceful and political solution through diplomacy is always possible. And not only that, but also on top of that, is inevitable throughout history. The only thing that you dictate in this process is how much more unnecessary death and destruction has to take place. Do you understand? It's that simple. All right. Think of how horrific and bloody an affair this was, the Troubles. And it wasn't that long ago, and now, I don't know, man, that seems a bit reductive. That's ridiculous. I'm simply stating this for all of the people that claim that there is no such there is no peaceful outcome in Gaza that is possible.
Months, but perhaps years or even decades. To accommodate this reality, the provosts reorganized. In their new structure, leadership would be transferred to Northern comrades. This was sensible enough. The North was the hotbed for the conflict. The IRA also began focusing on specialization, wherein individuals would be dedicated as snipers, bombers, or spies and have no knowledge of any other IRA movement. This would ensure increased security around critical intelligence. The provost also published the Green Book. This manual contained the aims and objectives of the IRA. Within its pages, the Green Book affirms the IRA as a continuation of the 1916 Republican Parliament, and so it framed the movement as not something fleeting, but something with a storied past and a long-term presence within Ireland. During the late 70s, the provosts also became significantly more ambitious with their targets. They attempted to assassinate Queen Elizabeth II with a bomb when she visited Ireland. The IRA assassinated the...
You're undermining resistance. There is a peaceful outcome, but the resistance to oppression is necessary. When have I ever undermined the resistance? I'm literally watching a pro-IRA video after spending the past 2 hours talking about how the designation of terrorism is ridiculous and oftentimes applied falsely to present those who have a moral cause, a cause that is just, whether it be Palestinian emancipation or Irish unification, against horrendous amounts of violence that the colonial subjects are put through. There's never been a moment where I've said that that is not a necessity. I'm simply stating the reality that the colonial entity in this process is what dictates the terms of the violence or whether or not violence will be an inevitability. You claim there will be peace, but demanding immediate peace as a dog whistle to end resistance is used consistently to do so? What? Dude, are you on crack? What are you talking about? Virtually everyone on this goddamn website, when you move like 3 steps away from this community, call me a radical Islamist fundamentalist terrorist, and you're over here being like, you're not sufficiently pro-Palestine. Shut the fuck up, woke of the day. Part of the reason why we're talking about this is literally because I am unconditionally pro-Palestine. The asking for peace is a colonialist dog whistle. Yeah, dude. That's what I'm doing. I'm doing colonialist dog whistles. Yeah. Remember when I was like saying stuff like, if Hamas let down their arms, then everyone could be free. Remember when I said that? Famously. If the IRA let down its arms, then everyone could be free. Is what I'm saying. That's my take. I hope that's your primary takeaway from my commentary over this video.
The manager of a DuPont chemical factory, saying British industrialists were legitimate targets because they exploited the Irish working class. Another Republican group, the INLA, killed British Conservative Party leader Ari Neave in a car bombing. It was an impressive get, but the IRA trumped it in the following year. Louis Mountbatten was a high-ranking British statesman, viceroy, and he was the cousin of the Queen herself. The IRA planted a bomb on his boat, killing him along with 3 others. That same day, IRA bombs also killed 18 British soldiers. The fact remained, though, the IRA was not anywhere near victory, so republicanism in Ireland began to examine once again political maneuvering. The IRA's stance had always been quite clear. They were a military organization that would not engage with or recognize any political body other than one of a united Ireland. However, the IRA also recognized that the electoral process could work alongside its armed struggle. Political action did not need to replace militarism. So the IRA began to espouse a combination of these things. It would be a ballot paper in one hand and an Armalite in the other, as one prominent IRA leader said. And yet another war was beginning on an entirely new front: the prisons. Imprisonment had become part of the IRA experience. Jails were full of Republicans, but up until this point, they were considered political prisoners. They were soldiers within a legitimate political struggle. By definition, these people were not criminals. This meant IRA prisoners were granted special circumstances in jail. They were allowed extra visits, regular food packages, and the right to wear their own clothes rather than prison uniforms. But the English thought this legitimized the IRA struggle. By holding IRA members as political prisoners, Republicans were seen as fighting for their freedom against an occupying force. So the British changed policy. The British sought to criminalize the IRA, hoping this would cast them as basically terrorists within public perception. The British removed IRA prisoners' political status and relocated them to jail cells called H-blocks. The IRA prison war could be its own essay, its own documentary, so unfortunately we will need to make some generalizations here. Suffice to say, the treatment experienced within the H-blocks was horrific. Prisoners were physically and mentally abused. The cells were infested with cockroaches and mice. Scabies ran rampant among Republican prisoners. A later report concluded that H-block treatment, quote, constituted cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment within the UN General Assembly's 1975 definition of torture. And indeed, in 1978, the British government would be found guilty of, quote, cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment by the European Court of Human Rights. But at the time, IRA members showed admirable insubordination. They began a series of prison strikes.
Remember, a tale as old as time itself. You can make anything illegal, okay? Like, no shit. What you have to do is scratch beneath the surface to understand whether or not that is a just law or one that is specifically designed to reassert colonial rule. If you've learned anything from your history textbooks, you know that history is riddled with great powers consistently implementing horrifying rules, unjustifiable rules, in an effort to criminalize, like in Nazi Germany, being Jewish, or defending or sheltering Jews, or in the antebellum South, in the South during time of chattel slavery, criminalizing the existence of free black men and sheltering or trying to liberate black men that were considered slaves. Okay? If you want a more modern version of this, it's not just Israel. Even in the United States of America, look at the designation of Look at the designation and criminal status that we automatically apply to migrants, even documented migrants, not just undocumented migrants. So just, remember that.
Republicans refused to wear prison uniforms, so the British forced the IRA to live naked in jail. In response, IRA prisoners started a no-wash policy, which was just as horrifically grimy as the name implies. As a result, these men lived in cells coated in urine and feces and infested with maggots. Other prisoners began now famous hunger strikes. Eventually, 10 prisoners starved to death, among them the now famous Bobby Sands. Members outside of the prisons often disapproved of the strikes or took only a reserved interest in them. Republicanism was beginning to shift in a more political direction, and many thought these strikes would distract from that change. In fact, the opposite proved to be true. The prison wars attracted international attention and embarrassment to English Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She was said to have Irish blood on her hands. Within Ireland, the strikes galvanized support for the Republican cause, especially amongst those who had hitherto remained quite ambivalent. The political counterpart to the IRA, Sinn Féin, enjoyed a swell of membership, legitimization, and forward progress on the backs of the strikes. The party became even more closely interwoven with the IRA, and within this context, the Republican movement went into a sort of political maturation. For the IRA, this happened largely within prison walls. Prisoners began to read and study the theories of Marx and Lenin, which provided a sort of framework for IRA political action. They also studied the Irish language and Irish history, which enabled members to strengthen their own political and cultural identities. Self-education became a core tenet of the IRA, and many members left jail more learned than their militant brothers who had remained in the field. Meanwhile, Sinn Féin abandoned the policy of election abstentionism. They then had modest success in elections and earned a small foothold in the formal governments of both Northern and Southern Ireland. However, this did not mean that violence was off the table.
W reading.
Around this time, one notable IRA leader said, if Sinn Féin were to win every election it contested, it would still not get an agreement on British withdrawal. We recognize that only disciplined, revolutionary armed struggle by the IRA will end British rule. In 1983, the
See, these are that read too much, okay? I mean, they weren't wrong, but
IRA shot and killed a unionist lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast. The next year, they attacked a Conservative Party conference in Brighton. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was present at the conference, was the primary target. The IRA planted a Semtex bomb at the...
Remember, we went to the site of the bombing when I was in Brighton? Both a beautiful, beautiful sight to behold, but also a unfortunate tragedy that they missed.
The conference hotel set to explode during the event. The bomb detonated and killed 5 conference members, but Thatcher escaped alive. In fact, the IRA only expanded its bombing targets during this time. In an announcement, the group declared that any contractors, builders, or buildings associated with the Royal Police Force were now legitimate targets. The killing raged on, taking the lives of not only Unionists, but IRA members themselves. The IRA mistakenly killed a number of Protestant civilians, though this proved to be a disastrous misstep. It heightened tensions and did very little to help the Republican cause amongst Protestant Irish. Increasingly, there was a feeling that the IRA was targeting Protestants, whether they were Unionists or not. Repeated accidental civilian death ensured that, for all practical purposes, no one was safe. Combine this with a decreasing efficacy of IRA violence, and the tide was turning against militant republicanism in the late 80s. The use of force seemed unable to produce a unified Ireland, so the Republican movement continued to take a more political shape. After the Conservative MP Ian Gow was killed by the IRA in 1990, the Loyalist side was also losing their faith in their ability to secure military victory, and so the British government sent a representative to meet with Sinn Féin in an effort to begin peace talks. This was not anything entirely new, but the amount of violence was now appearing untenable to both sides of the conflict. The result was a Christmas ceasefire at the end of 1990. The IRA halted violent action, but still left it as an option. Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams said, "When you have an occupation force, Sinn Féin believes people have the right to engage in armed resistance."
Around this stage, I was in a car that was hit with a firebomb. That's crazy. You want to see this, but Gerry Adams is the man behind the curtain calling for the hunger strikes to continue, knowing people would die, but he denies all association. This denial essentially ate other IRA members alive and drove them insane in anonymity after the troubles.
That is our political opinion. So this ceasefire was delicate, if nothing else. But in 1991, Adams furthered peace talks, expressing that he was open to a political solution. We believe that peace can be achieved. We are prepared to take political risks. We are prepared to give and take. We are committed to establishing a peace process. These talks dragged on for years, but it became clear that the British government had perhaps dastardly intentions. As a condition for further dialogue, the British demanded a surrender from the IRA. This incredible demand destroyed all progress. And so the early 90s saw more violence from the IRA as they continued to bomb and assassinate key targets. Despite this, Sinn Féin was still engaging in a long, arduous political strategy. And in 1994, the IRA released a statement that shocked the world. Recognizing the potential of the current situation and in order to enhance the democratic peace process and underline our definitive commitment to its success, the leadership of Ogla Naharan have decided that as of midnight, Wednesday, 31st August, there will be a complete cessation of military operations. All our units have been instructed accordingly. This was an historic moment. In September of that same year, the UK lifted its ban on Sinn Féin broadcasting, which had so far stifled the spread of pro-Vo messaging. In October, the Loyalist military announced they too would halt combat operations within Ireland. But why? Why the sudden shift for peace among Republicans and British alike? In his book, Armed Struggle, author Richard English provides significant insight. While the increasing violence certainly played a role, the world was changing dramatically in the early 90s. The IRA had always been a hardline leftist organization, but when the Soviet Union...
Do you still think the British are bad? I love this community. Immediately. Yes, they're doing targeting missions for Israel over Gaza. They're just as responsible for the genocide as America is. Okay, you're hyping up the British involvement a little bit too much. You're right that they are responsible. And someone should ask why there are so many British surveillance flights from Cyprus over the Gaza coastline. I wonder why that's happening, or why Keir Starmer went there. Weird. Just a weird thing that these European leaders are doing, even though they technically, too, are supposed to be under the ICC jurisdiction. Kid starver, seeing children not being starved or being starved, wanted to surveil it up close and personally. Piece of shit. Anyway, so the answer is yes. The British are still bad, just like America is, okay? The UK at this point is just basically broke boy America. They're still up to no good. They're still trying to do their own shit. Luckily limited by their, current conditions, I guess, but still trying to make the most. Such a sad state of affairs overall, man. What the is happening around the globe? There are wonderful, revolutionary people in all of these countries that I talk about, even Israel, okay? And the unfortunate reality is that these movements are so utterly stunted.
Collapsed. The international attitudes towards these politics changed. Left-leaning IRA members and Irish citizens both regarded socialism quite differently after the Soviet failure. Across the whole world, the collapse of communism had dealt quite a blow to anti-capitalist sentiment. As the Cold War ended, this also provided a way forward for the IRA. The UK was an ally with the US during this period, so America had stayed firmly out of Irish issues. Although historically uncharacteristic, American involvement was now opening the doors to peace. Bill Clinton was recently elected president, and he became quite instrumental in moving forward Irish peace efforts. He was sympathetic to Republican causes and helped...
It is kind of crazy that, like, the American Irish almost single-handedly caused America not to get involved in this. Because I feel like if they were to be involved initially, it would have been entirely on the British side. And the American involvement quite literally undermined. The American involvement almost across the board undermined the British position. Whether it be fundraising or laundering guns, like trafficking weapons into Ireland. But make no mistake, America's lack of official involvement in this process was a good thing. It's kind of wild.
Held a cache of global power that had always been absent from the movement. Free from the Cold War, Clinton could act for Ireland in ways that the British would not have appreciated. And he did just that. Clinton opened his doors to militant Republicans, even granting visas to prominent members of the movement. This put international light on the Irish struggle, breaking down barriers between the conflict and the influential Western world. The Irish had been strategically cut off and ghettoized by the British. In opening discussions with the Republicans, Clinton created a sort of counterbalance to the heavy thumb of the British government. The Republicans essentially had America on their side now, more or less mediating the conflict. Diplomacy had now created the European Union, which provided an indication that peaceful talk could indeed unify populations. The European Union also meant that London had a more integrated role within Ireland, rather than the distant one that had previously existed. Of course, we should recognize that Irish Republicans were still an autonomous group. Their own internal issues and developments also pushed them towards peace. Primarily, the war had reached a stalemate. The Irish had been unable to entirely break Britain down as they had originally planned. Furthermore, continuing violence would likely harm the Republican bargaining position. The longer they fought, the worse their reputation became, and the less deference they were allowed in negotiations. Conversely, as things stood, the Republicans could very likely produce positive results, even if those results were not entirely what they wanted. In some ways, the IRA was facing a now or never situation. However, the tone briefly changed when Britain laid out their conditions for peace talks. They called for a complete decommissioning of IRA weapons. To the IRA, this read basically as a demand for surrender, under which the Republicans would admit defeat. They saw it as an act of bad faith, meant only to weaken the movement. Key members of the IRA now believed the British had been using the ceasefire just for that purpose, to stall and weaken Republican efforts. So in 1996, the IRA canceled their agreement of cessation. They detonated bombs in London, and fighting resumed on both sides. Pressure shortly re-emerged for the IRA to renew the ceasefire, though, and resume peace talks. The pressure indeed resulted in another ceasefire in 1997, when the IRA were encouraged by a Labour Party victory in Britain. Tony Blair became the new Prime Minister. While not exactly a hero of the IRA, Blair was certainly more to their liking than previous leaders. Sinn Féin entered peace talks, this time with perhaps increased flexibility. A party leader said, "Negotiations are negotiations. You can't go in and dictate them and have a take-it-or-leave-it position. So we have to go in and listen. We will put our position, and we'll obviously look at all sorts of suggestions, ideas, and proposals put by others. We will consider all of that in the round as part of how you get a democratic peace settlement." Now, we should be careful not to paint with a broad brush. Certainly not all Republicans were enthused by the approach. But the ultimate result was indeed between all parties, Northern Ireland, the southern state, and Britain. This was known as the Good Friday Agreement. The agreement was immensely complex, and we need not review all of its many moving parts. But the broad takeaways were thus. It recognized that the majority of people in Northern Ireland did wish to maintain union with England. This was true. Unionism had widespread support in the North, even if the IRA alleged that it had been artificially implanted by the British. And so Northern Ireland would remain in the UK under the Good Friday Agreement. However, the agreement also recognized that
It was artificially implanted by the British. It's true. The fuck were they doing over there? Protestants, dude. Let me tell you something, okay? Don't get me started.
desire for a unified Ireland was legitimate and was held by a substantial amount of people in the North. So if the Northern majority opinion ever became a unified Ireland, all involved governments were obligated to respect and allow that decision. The agreement had been reached through Sinn Féin's work, who again were not part of the IRA, so for their say, the IRA did not wholly endorse the Good Friday Agreement. To do so would be a flagrant sort of compromise. In a statement, the IRA said, "Viewed against our..."
Good Lord, Chowder's being annoyed, questioning why they were called Republican. I mean, yeah, it's the Irish Republic. It's like China is the People's Republic of China. It doesn't mean that they're Republicans, like in the American understanding. Actually, around the globe, American politics is like kind of, it's kind of busted. Like liberal means right wing, which kind of is, right? I mean, it is right wing. But in the United States of America, when you say liberal, you think like leftist. Even the blue versus red is flipped. Like red is historically the color of communism. Like it is internationally known as the color of revolutionary communism. So it's kind of wild that like Republicans, the right-wing party, the reactionary party, the fascist party owns red here. Yeah, hence the Red Scare, exactly. With the exception of J.D. Pondon.
Republican objectives or any democratic analysis, this document clearly falls short of presenting a solid basis for a lasting settlement.
J.D. Pondon is worthy of the color
does
red.
Mark a significant development. Many IRA members saw the settlement as a peaceful stage on which they could further pursue their goals. The IRA also believed that changing demographics would eventually bring about the unified Ireland, which the agreement did allow. They were unsatisfied, but perhaps optimistic. In the wake of this, the topic of decommissioning once again came into the picture. Britain demanded that the IRA hand over all of their weaponry before Sinn Féin was allowed into a newly formed parliamentary structure. And once again, the IRA refused, perhaps rightly. Nowhere in the Good Friday Agreement had this provision been outlined, but rather it was yet another demand on top of an already unsatisfactory resolution. To hand over their weapons would also suggest an admittance of defeat, a surrender. Their entire reason for being was to defy the British Crown, so to hand over their weapons at the demands of that crown was unthinkable. Furthermore, decommissioning could delegitimize both the past and future use of force, which the IRA were not prepared to do. There was also the reality that violence hadn't ended. The Good Friday Agreement was a significant step, but it was not a panacea. Catholics were still being attacked and still needed defense. Certainly British loyalists would have very much liked the IRA to be disarmed, and that alone was another reason to refuse decommissioning. This threat of violence was one of the few bargaining chips which the IRA still possessed. But changing political dynamics within and outside of the country heaped pressure on the IRA to lay down their weapons. For the time being, it seemed clear that decommissioning simply had to happen. In 2001, the Provisional IRA reluctantly began the process of laying down their weapons. A delicate and perhaps unconvincing peace had been reached. The troubles were over. The violence was not. The fight for a unified Ireland is not one that belongs only to the past. Today, many former members of the IRA still see the Good Friday Agreement as disgraceful or illegitimate. The new IRA is a splinter group which emerged in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement. They are remarkably active, having committed numerous acts of violence since their inception in the late 2000s. However, modern Irish republicanism does not only take the form of violence. Today, Sinn Féin is still a political party which enjoys significant support in Ireland without any links to IRA violence. Certainly, party supporters would recognize that it's incorrect to permanently tie violence and Irish republicanism together. In any case, the tale of the IRA is one of political oppression and violence against it. Although a uniquely Irish story, it is built on ideas and fights that continue to appear in our world. The British colonized Ireland, fractured the country, and oppressed its residents for centuries. These invaders were offered, time and time again, peaceful methods of exit. Time and time again, they refused. Perhaps the British should not have been so shocked when people started dying. In their principled efforts, the IRA committed atrocities, accidentally and intentionally.
I think a united struggle, both through peaceful means, no matter how exhausted they may seem, no matter how impossible they may seem, is a profoundly important part of this process. Just as important as the sometimes violent or militant revolutionary part of the struggle. It is always working hand in hand. I think that is probably my most moderate centrist position. A lot of people will disagree with me on this and say, no, the only pathway forward is simply just to engage in violent struggle and forcefully purge your ranks or your national boundaries from the invading forces or from the colonial power. But I do think that, at least through everything I've seen throughout history, the absolute best path forward is to keep pressure across the board and to still maintain a peaceful wing, a peaceful but still revolutionary wing of your movement. Because once the fighting inevitably ends, okay, once the fighting inevitably ends, you need someone to play the role of the peacekeeper. You need someone to run the country. And that someone who runs the country, if they are if they maintain this militant perspective, if they maintain this militancy across the board, then usually you end up with a lot of purges, or you end up with a lot of violence in the aftermath, unnecessary violence at that point.
People outside of the country can sit here, far removed from the conflict, and say the IRA should have done this or should not have done that. We can say they should have just stuck with peaceful protest. But this is to engage with an imagined reality, with scenarios that are to us entirely hypothetical and so are tremendously easy to navigate. I think more prudent is to recognize truth. When people are pushed, they will push back, and they have every right to push back. Meanwhile, we who stand on the sidelines have no right to dictate how they do so.
What an interesting and timely documentary from horses from 11 months ago. It is almost a direct one-to-one comparison to perhaps something that is ongoing, perhaps something that is still happening right now, something that is happening maybe in another country, far, far away from Ireland. Hasan Reactions is one of the best ones in the React channel.